And when you begin to look at some of the ancient gods, I don't believe any ancient pagan god embodies the values and the sentiments of contemporary modernity or the information age like the Greek Hermes. Why do I say that? Well, let me just list you some of the attributes that Hermes is associated with. Number one, he's the god of boundaries. How many times have I gone on here and talked about the dissolution of boundaries? We can look at the androgyny, of which Hermes ironically is androgynous, typifying his sort of transgression or ability to be on both sides of a boundary. So he's both male and female. He's sort of hermaphroditic. In fact, where we get from hermaphrodite comes from the son of Hermes, who is called Hermaphroditis. So hermaphroditic tendencies, again, comes from the Hermaphroditus, the son of Hermes. The god of boundaries. Everything we look at the world right now is a sort of attack on the boundaries. And boundaries themselves that I've talked about, at least from a traditional Christian perspective, are maintained by the masculine presence, by men, by masculine traditional men. And so as we see the eroding and the degradation of Western society, we see also the attack on masculinity, the loss of tradition, and therefore the dissolution of boundaries. And I've talked about how psychedelics, drugs generally speaking, but psychedelics specifically, phenomenologically, experientially dissolve these boundaries. And I think this is a sort of preemptive catalyst for people to adopting relativistic worldviews because they essentially just believe whatever their personal experience is. And so Hermes is the god of boundaries. So interesting, right? The god of boundaries, and I think this is going to be really useful to understand in regards that Hermes is not good or evil, right? Hermes is not a sort of satanic figure per se. Now, obviously, we would say he's a Luciferian figure. You say he's a sort of Promethean figure and some of these other things that we'll get into. But my point in saying he's not good or evil is not talking from a Christian perspective. Of course, paganism isn't consistent with our own worldview. What I'm meaning is he's not good or evil in the sense that he is a trickster figure. He's not, it's his own volition, it's his own will, right? Some of the things, and let me get into more of these attributes, right? Hermes is the god of roads and travelers. So international trade, international travel, right? Those who are on the move. He's the god of thieves. He's the god of shepherds. He's the god of athletes. He's the god of commerce. He's the god of speed. He's the god of writing, the god of science, the god of magic, the god of technology itself. He's a magical god. He is a trickster god. He's the god of communication, and he's an androgynous god. So let's again work through some of these attributes to see again how they match up with our current state of the world. The god of boundaries, as I said, we don't need national boundaries are on the attack. Gender boundaries are on the attack. Personal boundaries between your body and the state, we saw under attack in 2020, 2021, and still to some degree under 2022. I mean, people who are still getting boosters, there's really no help for them. You know, people who aren't awake yet are sort of already in their alternate reality. But roads and travelers, why is that related to the contemporary period? Well, what point in history is there more of an opportunity to travel? What point in history is there more of an opportunity to use roads to move from place to place? You can look at we can point to the sort of the transportation systems developed by the Nazis, which then is our sort of contemporary highway system in the United States. But no point in history were the roads and travel as accessible and easy as it is right now. Again, and Hermes is the god of roads and travelers. Thieves. Hermes is the god of thieves. Does thievery resonate at all in our contemporary period? Well, I think absolutely so. Of course, we're in the midst of a great reset, which it itself is a sort of thievery in regards to the consolidation of wealth into smaller and smaller and fewer hands. We could look at the Federal Reserve and a little thing called Jekyll Island and the U.S. promissory notes that we use as our currency because obviously it's not backed by gold anymore. That, I would argue, is a form of thievery. We can look at, contemporary divorce courts. I've talked about how men have no leverage, and depending on what state you're in. But in a way, their kids can be stolen from them by the state, or at least siding with an angry wife, which sort of steals the family away. We can look at, so many aspects of our world today. It's about theft. And the powers that be are constantly thieving and stealing from those below. And at the same time, as we see the 21st century crime continue to get worse and worse, it's not like our cities are becoming more of a trust society, right? More of an unknown, we're not becoming more homogenous and more consolidated. No, we're becoming more separate. Crime is on the rise. Personal thievery is on the rise. So not just now, the sort of institutional thievery that we're seeing, or the inflation. This is another form of thievery. We're seeing the deliberate collapse of the Western world, the money laundering operation known as the Ukraine-Russian war. That all this is aiding in the inflationary process, which is again thieving wealth from us. And if you have enough of it, doesn't matter if they cut the wealth in half or the value of money in half, because those at the top, if they especially have real assets, it doesn't really matter. And so theft, I couldn't think of a point in which the world is in more of a theft or a thievery type state. Guys, smash that like for everybody who's here. Please smash that like. I hope you guys like tonight's stream. So thieves are certainly empowered in the contemporary world. What about, hackers? People who thieve through, again, the electronics, the digital technologies, which is really communication technologies and digital technologies. I really want to hone in, again, this information age, why this age is unique, and why then this stuff connects with Hermes. So the next one is shepherds. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into how Hermes relates to shepherds, and that's our contemporary life, but I do want to make a point as we dive deeper in here in regards to the origination of writing, the alphabet, language, and stuff like that I think we're also going to see a sort of contention between Logos and Hermes, Christ and Hermes. And we're going to see this in regards to the word or to language, and also to the development of Scripture, the book, the Bible, reading itself, writing systems. And so I can't help but think how Hermes also sort of fulfills that progressive, Gnostic, magical sort of Christ consciousness. What do I mean by that? Well, Hermes is androgynous. How many people want to talk about Christ as being androgynous? He's a sort of god of magic. How many people want to talk about Christ being a magician? Right, here's one of the famous books doing that, Jesus the Magician by the homosexual Morton Smith. Often, language, logos, writing, all this different stuff, communication. There's some god of boundaries. Logos, of course, creates boundaries. Hermes is noted for his ability to transgress boundaries, and that's why Hermes is a psychopomp. Hermes aids the soul in their journeying from life to death. In some places, is part of the sort of judgment. He's the sort of secretary of the gods in the Greco contents. So I think this sort of judging figure, this sort of psychopomp, we see some similarities with Logos or how we understand Christ. And I'm going to dive deeper into how I believe the war, this information age war, and again, where his sort of powers that be are actually in a sort of realm that is bootstrapped in regards to the ability to use language and writing particularly, that our minds actually move into a realm that is at a higher order than that of the illiterate tribes that read nature, right? That walk past a rock and hear the rock speak to them. That language and the alphabet and writing lifts us, it bootstraps us, our minds, our cognition out of that natural world, and where we are animistic in that we read nature. And you can see then the blending into sort of hieroglyphics with the Egyptian that still have 1 foot in the animistic world and 1 foot in the linguistic world. Same thing with China. But the Phoenicians develop a unique technology called the alphabet. And of course, the Phoenicians also rub off on the Hebrews, and we see the use of an alphabet then in the Old Testament. But it isn't until the Greek language that vowels are introduced. So the completion of the technology of writing of the alphabet is fulfilled in the Greek language, which is ironic then that the New Testament uses Greek to express the revelation and the incarnation of the Logos itself, the Word of God. And so it's this higher order realm in which we're starting to deal with logic and semiotics. And this is why Plato is unique. Plato's the first philosopher in Greece to sort of, his mind is lifted out of that order. And he then is working in the realm of language. And I think that's tied even to his then adoption of the ideal forms. Because the alphabet itself provides a sort of precondition for the concept of an ideal form. The completed alphabet itself is sort of a circular form. It's a perfect form itself. And then words are sort of pieces of, right? So anyways, Hermes is the god of athletes. We live in a time in which men, particularly, we are inundated with sports and trivial aspects of male accomplishments to sort of deprive us of our true curiosity of sort of knowing the world. So today is Saturday. Soon we'll be entering in the fall. And I will confess, I like watching football. I like college sports. But soon Saturday and Sundays, as we move into the fall period, is just going to be dominated by not day streaming but day drinking at various football games, in a sort of obsessiveness with like team sports and teams. And so Hermes is the god of athletes. And at the same time, in the 21st century, look how much athletes are getting paid. I don't know if you guys are familiar with what's going on in the NFL, but Deshaun Watson, a gentleman who just got hired or traded to the Cleveland Browns, hasn't played in over a year, made $10 million last year for not playing, just signed a contract to $200-some million of guaranteed money. Meanwhile, he can't even play football because he has a problem with hiring 60-some massage therapists and having 40-some cases of sexual assault. So we see then Deshaun Watson, contributing to the sort of very weird behavior in regards to his massage therapist. I digress, though. The point being is the dude who just committed that, hadn't played football in 2 years, just signed one of the biggest contracts in NFL history by the Cleveland Browns, $200 million to play football, and he hasn't played in 2 years, and he can't play for the first 11 games this season due to his behavior. And so, again, Hermes comes to the fore. Who else would we pray to, or the pagans pray to on behalf of athletes other than Hermes? And so this comes next to commerce. We're living in a world that's totally dominated. Let's give the credit to those who criticize capitalism. Anybody who's played Monopoly knows that capitalism ends in the same state that socialism and communism begins. The sort of centralized effort. Yes, it may be private monopolization, but it's still the monopoly of power itself. The sort of Adam Smith, guarantees of the free market. It's an idealistic utopian concept that really doesn't play itself out in the real world to some degree. We see the continual monopolization of everything. And so that has led then to, again, as Christians, we believe the whole world's moving towards a sort of one world government figure. And so commerce, corporations, corpses, right? These sort of dead bodies that we call corporations, these corpses sort of run our society. Right? And they're given the rights as if they're a human living entity, just none of the responsibilities. So they can't be arrested, they can't go to prison, all this stuff. They're sort of given all the benefits, but not all the responsibilities of being a person, these corporations. And we see how the corporations, again, we're in the midst of the Great Reset, are absolute catalysts to this consolidation of power and our own imprisonment. And so again, Hermes is the god of commerce. And it's through the commerce that we both feel like we're sort of free, but at the same time, we're also imprisoning ourselves. And this sort of habitual consumerism is the loss of sort of individuality and uniqueness and awareness. And that's where this problem we saw with the BLM, with 2020, we saw how people's consumeristic habits and the corporations then coming out with political ideologies and propaganda influences people's own personal opinions. Because we're in a state now where tradition's been eroded, religion's been eroded, ultimate authority's been eroded. So what do people depend on? Well, my own personal opinion, my own belief, my own experience, and therefore my own hedonism, and that leads into my own consumerism. So the corporations and the goods that I consume, and now Supreme and Nike and whoever, Harley Davidson, it doesn't matter what it is, now they're all supporting BLM or whatever it is. Commerce, then, again, the god of commerce is Hermes. We are living in the most commercial time in history. There's never been a more commercial time in history than right now. Speed, the speed of communication. When we look at the depictions of Hermes or Mercury, he has wings. Hermes has wings on his helmet. Mercury has wings on his sandals. But we see this like with Sprint. If you look up the symbolism of Sprint, the way at least it used to look, it was a wing. Why? Because the wing is the wing on the foot of Hermes, the god of communication, the god of messages, the god of writing. And so Sprint, as a telephone company, a company tapping into the sort of electronic world to send messages to people, to communicate, they're appropriated the symbolism of Hermes himself with the wing. So speed. We have never existed at a point in which the communicative speed of the world is absolutely phenomenal right now. Now, of course, now we're surrounded with orbiting 5G satellites. And so these 5G satellites then create the environment for instantaneous communication across the world. And so speed then, that's why we look at 2020 and the propaganda that and why it was so efficacious is because through the digital communicative technologies, which again are indicative of the information age, Hermes, Mercury, Thoth of the Egyptian context, is providing that instantaneous communication across the world. As Marshall McLuhan said, these digital technologies then begin to affect us. And this is where sort of the trickery comes from, because Hermes is a trickster figure, is that as we've talked about, these technologies are extensions of ourselves. And every time we adopt a technology, doesn't matter if it's a hammer or it's the personal iPhone, that they change us to some degree. That man is like Homo sapien, is like Homo or a tool, right? It's like we are defined by our tools. Language is a tool, writing is a tool, but tools themselves then come to define us because we as a species extend ourselves out into the world through our tools. But as Marshall McLuhan talks about, all these tools both give and take away. They both provide an opportunity and atrophy your innate skills. And so this is why, as we'll look at, Socrates was worried about writing. Well, Socrates didn't write anything down. Socrates believed that writing things down using the alphabet, using, again, these linguistic writing technologies would atrophy the human mind, memory, and the ability to orate. And as we now look in the 21st century, he was right. These technologies at the same time are atrophying our natural abilities while providing sort of other opportunities. And I've talked about MapQuest, for example, the sense of direction people have. People don't have a sense of direction because they're always using their phone to give them directions. And this was an important thing for a man. A man should be able to know where north is. You know, you should be able to put him somewhere and he'll be able to figure out which direction's north, where to go, how to navigate. And so we're losing a lot of these innate abilities due to the speed of these new technologies. And so again, at no point has the speed of communication been as fast as it is now. And this is indicative, again, of us living in the age of Hermes, the information age. And so another attribute is writing in hieroglyphs. As we'll talk about, there's a whole mentioning of Thoth, Hermes, and the Picatrix. There's an example of Socrates talking about Thoth and the desire to introduce writing to the Egyptian people. Writing is a major thing. This is a difficult one for us to really wrap our minds around, is that we exist in the mind, the sort of bootstrap, the higher order of being that is innate to people who can read and write. Most people in history, again, the illiterate people, they read nature. They did not read and write. And so there's a book by David Abrams called The Spell of the Sensuous. And now, again, he's an advocate of psychedelics and all this stuff. He's a phenomenologist. But his book is really interesting because it shows how Native American tribes, specifically in Alaska, they have developed languages that are very old. These are native peoples, illiterate peoples. They don't have writing technologies. And so their language, they believe that they communicate with a sort of tribal bird. I think it's like the cuckoo bird or something like this. And so when they hear that bird sing its songs, to them, those are words in their own language. And so for these particular Native Americans in Alaska, they then view nature as a sort of book. Now, they wouldn't say it that way because the book doesn't exist to them. Writing technologies don't exist to them. However, they read nature. And nature then comes at them. And so all the animals, all the plants, all the rocks have a voice. They speak to them. They're constantly in communication with the natural world. This is the sort of animistic mind. This is the primitive man. And so it's through then the entrance of writing that man was lifted out, and this was across cultures. Again, we can point to the Phoenicians with the sort of introduction of the alphabet, and the Hebrews adopted it, but the Hebrews didn't have vowels. It wasn't until the Greek language adopted vowels that the sort of technology of the alphabet was complete. Because there was other people developing writing technologies, like I pointed to, the ancient Chinese and the Egyptians, who used more of a pictorial glyph, because they had still one leg in the animistic world, so their writing technologies mimic the sort of visual cues of the world. That's why they use hieroglyphs, or why they use Chinese pictorial graph characters, because the glyphs themselves represent the visual stimuli of nature. This is very different from the alphabet. The alphabet is a contained system. In a way, the alphabet doesn't change. This is what's really interesting, and this is where I think the theology of the logos and all this stuff really enters, because when you think about language, the map is not the territory. The words are not the same thing as the reality itself, but at the same time, which one's more important and which one's more primary? And so for Plato and some of these Greeks, they began to think, well, geez, language, the alphabet, almost exists in like the realm of the ideal forms. It doesn't change, right? The way we use the alphabet, the way we use language, the things we talk about, those things are maybe constantly changing, but the sort of linguistic structure itself, the language, the alphabet itself is like a technology that's divorced from the sort of the evolution or the constant flow and change of time. And this is where I think that's because it's logos. It's the Alpha and the Omega. That is Christ. Christ, through language, through the word, through writing the words, lifts us out of that animistic reality, lifts us out of that animistic mode of being, and brings us into this higher order. Now, you look across these pagan cultures, and they tend to have linguistic, communicative deities. And so this is where Hermes, then, I think, is really interesting, because you have all these narratives of Thoth introducing writing to the Egyptians. And Thoth is just the Egyptian version, which then gets transmutated into Hermes in the Greek and Mercury in the Roman. And then later, you have Hermes Trismegistus, which is a sort of amalgamation of all three into now a historical person. Of course, the person Hermes Trismegistus never existed, but he is the sort of he's the archetypal amalgamation of Thoth, Hermes, and Mercury, all the same sort of messenger, linguistic, magical deities. And so it's hard for us to really appreciate the development of alphabets and language in the ancient world. This is ginormous, and this is a technology. This is the extension of man. Now, I perceive this again as logos. This is Christ. This is God. This is the word of God literally building that bridge. Like, it's by us adopting language, we sort of, again, bootstrap ourselves into a higher order. That is God, like, coming down and lending a hand and pulling us out of that animistic, more irrational realm so that we can begin to engage in mathematics and logic and all this stuff. And that's why Plato is the first Greek philosopher to really adopt that language. And I think his philosophies of the ideal forms and stuff like that is totally in step with and consistent, I think, with the presuppositions of his use of the alphabet and written language itself. And I think that's a really underestimated attribute of the alphabet. And I think we as modern people are just so we just do not appreciate language and the role of language, because that's again the digital technologies. I argue again it's this higher realm that I argue the logos, the word itself, but again from the Greek pagan perspective, it's Hermes that brings us into this sort of writing linguistic realm. And here is all the semiotic processes, right? Doesn't matter if we're talking about magic, doesn't matter if we're talking about mythology or archetypes or mathematics or science. They're all semiotics. They're all symbol systems. We couldn't exist in that symbolic system realm without the use of the alphabet, without writing. And so there then is the real battle. And it's these communication technologies then where we're all being manipulated by the symbols. And that's why I believe when we follow the logos, when we follow Christ, we're given true symbols. We're able to understand and decipher the symbols more accurately. And then we become more sort of immune to the magic, because there is real sorcery and magic going on here, to the use of other words. And I've said this before about spells. Aleister Crowley talked about spells. Spells just mean to spell a word, and this was never more evident than in ancient Egypt. Again, that Egyptian culture, especially when they were developing the hieroglyphics, again, which they claim came from Thoth, that 1 foot in the animistic realm, 1 foot now into this higher order of language, this new semiotic perception of man's mind, that this is a sort of higher order phenomenon, and this is where the world is happening. And I totally agree then with Prescott when he says we're going back to hieroglyphics with the emojis. Absolutely, because language, we can't think without the words we use, and that's why reading is a development. That's why it's so strange, right? Now, why is it that when we read books, it's like ourselves are extended, like we literally become more of who we are? Because somehow there is a very dynamic and interesting process when humans read books, read words. Again, this higher order phenomenon that, the mental images, the expansion of your language, the expansion of the concepts you have. You literally cannot think. You cannot grow your mind without words. And that's why reading is such a useful practice, because it literally expands the contours of your mind. Your mind is wider, fuller, more expansive the more you read. And so as Prescott mentioned, we're moving back to hieroglyphics with the use of emojis. Absolutely. And this is part of the inability of people to think. This is the broken brain syndrome. But again, Hermes is the god of both. He's the god of the emojis, of the language, of communication, generally speaking. And he's a trickster god. So a trickster god is always pulling tricks on you. And so as Hermes, again, the god of the information age, is pulling tricks on us with the techne. And that's the next thing that I want to point to, is he's the god of art and technology. Hermes is the god of art and technology. And where have we existed in a point in which art and technology is more powerful than it is right now? I'm talking about art, Hollywood, movies, the music industry with Cardi B and all this different stuff. right? Art, the abstract expressionism, like this dumb art, like this low quality art actually prevents us from sort of seeing the transcendent realm of aesthetic, right? The good, the true, and the beautiful, to use the sort of Platonic trinity, if you will. The good, the true, and the beautiful. Contemporary art blocks us from these things on purpose because obviously they're trying to kill our soul, but it's like Hermes is playing a trick on us as a trickster deity, as a sort of coyote figure, right? And so I think it's really interesting. He's the God of art and technology. He's the God of science. God of science. So how interesting. We've never existed in a time in which scientism wasn't as authoritative as it is right now, right? So again, the information age is the same age in which, well, science says so. But science doesn't exist by consensus. It exists by, debate and argumentation and evidence. Well, the science says so. The CDC said so. The World Health Organization said so. And so ironically, in the name of science, the god of science, Hermes, we see, again, a world in which science is expanding outside the contours of the scientific method and into a sort of religious phenomenon. And that was the last stream I did with Father Deacon on Gnostic scientism. It clearly has Gnostic scientism has Gnostic elements that certainly are looking very religious, and therefore, again, ironic that all this is occurring in the information age. Now, lastly, I want to point out that Hermes is a god of magic, and he's androgynous, just like Baphomet. So again, as we talked about how he's the god of boundaries, he's also an androgynous god, which shows that he's not good or evil. He's the combination of opposites. Now, I don't mean that he's not good or evil. As a Christian, what I'm meaning is the people who follow Hermes don't see him as good or evil, because he's a trickster figure. He's sort of both and. He is the circle that encapsulates both the yin and the yang, the bad and the good, the left and the right. And so he's not really either one or the other. He's sort of both. He's the trickster figure and he's the magician. And so at what point, again, I believe technology and the contemporary pursuits of technology is underpinned by a magical spirit. This is the basis of my PhD research, is that I believe when you start to look into, let's look at the modern, what's the contemporary foundations of the use of pills, for example, extracting what was believed to be the essences out of plants and putting them in capsules. Paracelsus. Well, Paracelsus was a German hermeticist, magician, Christian, Kabbalist, all this different stuff. And no doubt was he absolutely impactful in his development of various medical processes. He also developed laudanum, which is the sort of alcohol tincture of opium, a mixture of like 80% alcohol, say with 20% opium. Then you can drink laudanum and you can become inebriated, and this was used for surgeries and all this different stuff. So Paracelsus was an essential sort of founder of contemporary medicine, but his main focus was a hermeticist and an alchemist. And so we look at, what were the ancient alchemists interested in? Well, over in China, they wanted the elixir of immortality. And in the West, especially where we can look at the 16th century, the 1500s, it was all about the philosopher's stone. And the philosopher's stone was believed to be some mundane black rock that you could then do anything with. You could fly on it. You could, it could protect you. You needed a shower, you hold it over your head, it'll shower. It is the magical stone. The philosopher's stone could do anything that the person who had the stone wished it to do. It's like a genie's lamp, but there's no genie and there's infinite wishes. That was the philosopher's stone. And that's what the alchemist was after, and often the magician. This is the basis for John Dee and Edward Kelly in their adventures in Europe. And yet that's exactly what contemporary science is after. I mean, look at these digital technologies. Look at the transhumanism. Look at Silicon Valley. I just watched a video of Noah Harari talk about how over $1 billion has been dropped into the pursuit of immortality within Silicon Valley. He's kind of, again, he's the sort of priest figure of the World Economic Forum. But Yuval Harari was talking about how, oh, yeah, absolutely, like man's going to be redefined, so man's no longer going to be man in the biological and definitional sense he's historically been, which we've talked about before. But then he talked about how in Silicon Valley that he already knows that at least $1 billion has already been dropped in the last 3 years for the pursuit of immortality, and Google is behind it. So Google claims that they've solved search, now they're going to solve death. And as a Christian, I find this horrific because the only way we enter into eternity is through that doorway of death. And what if Google and its sort of satanic yearnings actually wants to keep you in a state and prevent you from ever dying and putting you, and that is hell, right? It's like the opposite of freedom. They don't let you die and they put you in prison for the rest of your immortal life. It's the metaverse. It's the satanic prison. It's hell. And so we already know that Silicon Valley is basically pursuing these sort of transcendental religious quests, right? The quest for immortality, the quest for omnipotence, the quest for omnipresence. They're already doing this. This is essentially a religious enterprise. This is essentially the basis of magic. And so I believe magic in its fullest sense is absolutely being enacted out through the technology, which is again why Hermes is the god of the information age. It's not just he's the god of boundaries. It's not just he's the god of roads and travelers. It's not just thieves. It's not just athletes and commerce and the speed of communication and the god of writing and science and technology and trickery and magic. See, it's all these things together. It's the fields in which Hermes dominates that we then are being controlled by. And I believe magic is absolutely, it's more pernicious now than it ever has, but people just don't know what it is because the post-Enlightenment sort of schism, the break of the sort of mystical and the rational, people think they're being rational when they're really being mystical. This is the BLM enterprise. This is Kufid. This is what we saw in 2020, right? That's what these people are. So I think it's so interesting, again, that we look at these attributes of Hermes, the magic, the technology, the language, the writing and communication, the speed of light, and this is the age that we live in. All these realms are the realms associated with Hermes. And I remember when I myself was into Hermeticism, which is then a tradition, a philosophical sort of religio-philosophical tradition developed on the basis of the Hermes Trismegistus figure, the guy, the personified amalgamation of Thoth, Hermes, and Mercury, as I mentioned. And so I think it's really interesting to look at Hermeticism versus Christianity. Hermeticism privileges the unity over multiplicity, taking the sort of Neoplatonic framework of the time. That's exactly what I believe the world is doing now. Again, the privilege of unity over multiplicity. You got to get immunized because you got to save the other person, so we all have to get immunized. Well, what about my own individual right? Oh, that doesn't exist anymore. The multiplicity doesn't exist. The individual doesn't exist anymore. It's only the collective. It's only the one world government. It's only climate change. It's only the dissolution of your national boundaries so that we can help the poor, right? It's and again, it's the transgression of boundaries, which he's the god of. And so Hermeticism and this privileging of unity over multiplicity, I think is totally consistent with many things going on in the contemporary world. The other attribute of Hermeticism, which differentiates it from Christianity, which I think is so profound looking at the contemporary moment, is its use of will, right? Through the sort of existential use of will, you can become divinized. This is the promise of Hermeticism. This is the promise of their sort of theurgic, ritualistic, magical practices. Part of the Hermetic corpus is literally telling Asclepius how to inhabit daemons into statues. Which again is ironic because you look at all the arts, right? The techne, he's the god of art. The Golden Globes, the Emmys, right? We have all our artists are also pursuing golden statues just like Moses condemned the Jews, right? So we look at the artists of our society, they're all idolatrous in a way, in the sort of pursuit for these sort of magical talismanic statues, these little golden statues that they're given. When I started to think about it, I was like, that is magical. Like, wait, what's going on there? And so this Hermeticism permits, and this is why it exploded during the Italian Renaissance, right? The Hermetic corpus got translated by Marsilio Ficino during the Italian Renaissance. This is the mid-1400s, 15th century. And this spawned the sort of most magical period of European history. It's really from the Renaissance in Florence up to the 1700s, the Enlightenment, where a lot of this stuff was stopped. But the 1600s, the 1500s, the 16th century, the most magical century in Europe. And this is where we get John Dee and all the alchemists and a lot of those sort of archetypal frameworks that we get. But the reason why it was so successful in Europe is because for the first time it permitted people to pursue their will ritualistically and theurgically. Right? Again, criticize Western Catholicism, if you will, Western Christianity and the Latin Church. Plenty to go on there. But at least to some degree, before the Italian Renaissance, magic was not condoned. The performance of theurgic rituals for the acquirement of your own will or desire was not condoned. We did rituals, not magic, because it was always to the will of God. Right? If you wanted something, you went to church, participate in the Eucharist, and you ask God if that's God's will for it to be done. You don't do a magical ritual, sort of theurgic enterprise to attain it, which is exactly what we saw as Hermeticism spread. So as Hermeticism just totally spread through Europe, that's what we saw, is that people felt free to use the alchemy and the Hermeticism and whatever magical technique because now they just conformed Christianity to also the pursuit of their will, which somehow then deified them and brought them closer to Christ. And that's exact difference. It's such subtleness, right? But our theos is about submitting to the will of God, where their apotheos is about fulfilling their own will, which brings them closer to being God. It's so subtle, but it's a major difference. And so, as I said, Hermes is the god of the information age, the god that transcends boundaries. And that's exactly the transgenderism, the androgyny, the hermaphroditism, the drag queen story hour. What could be more indicative? It's really, in a way, allowing people to sort of embody that androgynous spirit, that Baphomet or even the Hermetic or the Mercurian spirit, which is of basic androgyny. Again, the dissolution of boundaries, because we as Christians believe God created male and female, and they reject these categories, which is exactly what we see today. And so this is, again, indicative of him being beyond good and evil, because he's beyond male and female. He's androgynous. He's beyond these categories. He's the god of techne, magic, and writing. Language, as I said, bootstraps us into a higher realm of being. The alphabet in ideal forms. This is something that Socrates was worried about. Hermeticism versus Christianity. The difference is in the will and the unity over multiplicity, and therefore the war of this Hermetic, this spiritual war, is in the war of the realm of the semiotic, which is again indicative of what Orthodoxy teaches, that it's the realm of the mind, right? It's our mind that participates in this sort of semiotic reality that we're embedded in. We're swimming in a semiotic ocean, and we don't realize that we take that ocean to be nature itself. It's not. We're existing at a different order. And this is, again, why I think the Word of God became a man, to indicate that this is the sort of new ontological state of man, is belonging in the sort of the Word, the linguistic, this higher order of being. So, anyways, guys, that's my opening monologue. I got a lot of stuff I want us to get through. I cannot believe it's already... Get into this stream a little further. Oh, Pim Orso throws in $20. Shout out to Pim. Thank you so much, brother. I really, really appreciate that. Okay, so first thing I want to do is let's do a little bit of a deeper dive into Hermes. So here we go. Let me pull this article up. Okay. So this is a really good site. It's called Mythopedia. It's like Wikipedia, but it's on mythology. And they give some really good overviews. So here, I'll share this link with you guys, what we're looking at here. This is the Mythopedia page for Hermes. And we're just going to quickly go through this because this is going to be the fullest sort of background and informative update on who Hermes is. And then I have some passages in this book, again, that I really want to read to you guys. This is a really interesting book, and it kind of goes along with my opening monologue there. But anyways, who is Hermes? So let's look here. Hermes was a trickster deity of the Greek gods, using wit and wile to accomplish his goals. An Olympian with a divine messenger, he played a role in many myths and poems, including Homer's epics. Okay, so let's zoom in here. Hermes is the god of commerce and luck, patron of travelers, thieves, merchants, and champion of athletes and athletic competitions. Hermes was a wily trickster who often put up his own amusement above the interest of the gods. As herald and messenger of the gods, Hermes delivered the news, advice, and commands that maintained order and sustained the gods' fragile, tumultuous relationship. Hermes could also be unpredictable, however. Driven by impish designs and a fondness for sport, he routinely tricked, deceived, and in several well-known instances, stole from the gods. Okay. Like other trickster gods, Hermes tested norms. Obviously, he's androgynous, challenged conventions, and crossed boundaries. Does that sound maybe a little indicative of the 21st century, of the information age? I would say so. He was neither good nor evil, although he was capable of both. He instead chose to operate at the periphery of things, tilting chaotically in one direction or the other according to his whims. Again, so Hermes worshipped in a way his own will, which is consistent with Hermeticism, which is consistent with the history of magic itself. And so I think that, again, is an important point, that even as a deity, Hermes sort of always went with his own desires, his own whims. Hence his role as the patron saint of thieves and merchants, those who are then driven by their own whims. In addition to oscillating between good and evil, Hermes also moved freely between Olympus, the mortal world, and the underworld. For the ancient Greeks who worshipped him, Hermes often represented the disorder and moral relativism they saw in the world. Okay, so you're telling me the ancient Greeks, they were part of the Hermetic cults of Hermes, saw him as representative of disorder and moral relativism. Guys, what could be more iconic and archetypal of our present age? It's absolutely Hermes. Etymology. The name Hermes seems to have originated from the Mycenaean period, the earliest period of Greek history. It was first written as Imaha in the syllabic linear B script used before the invention of the Greek alphabet. Hermes' name may have been related to the ancient Greek herma, a cairn or heap of stones used to indicate the boundaries of something. Indeed, many of these herms were dedicated to Hermes, and that's why we call something hermetically sealed, is that boundary can't be penetrated, right? If something is hermetically sealed, that means it's really tightly sealed, that boundary is maintained. But it was not clear where the word Herma comes from or how exactly it linguistically related to the term Hermes. Scholars today generally agree that Hermes' name is a pre-Greek in origin. So here is Hermes. That's how you would say it. Hermes. You see the rough breathing here in the Greek. So the rough breathing, E-R-M-E-S, Hermes. Hermes' Roman counterpart was called Mercury. Yes, epithets. Hermes' was most common literary epithet was Argiophontes, meaning killer of Argus. This related to the famous myth in which Hermes outsmarted and killed the 100-eyed guardsman, Argus. And that's what I used for the thumbnail. So you saw Hermes playing his flute and putting Argus to sleep, the 100-eyed monster, to kill him. In a way, I say that Hermes playing his flute, he's kind of putting mankind to sleep, and he's killing us slowly through these technologies, again, as a sort of trickster figure. Other important epithets related to Hermes mythology include Atlantitis, meaning descendant of Atlantis. Hermes' mother, Maia, was the daughter of Titan Atlas. Okay, yada, yada, yada. Other epithets described important attributes of Hermes. These included dolios, trickery, angelos, and diaktoros. Okay. Finally, Hermes boasted numerous religious and cult epithets that described his many function as a god. Among those were he of the road, conductor of dreams, shepherd of men, he of the market, and conductor of souls. Attributes, domains. As a god, Hermes was primarily associated with 4 domains. 1, the messengers and the heralds. 2, boundaries, travel, and commerce. 3, shepherds. And 4, the mysteries. In these capacities, Hermes presided over many areas of human life. As the messenger of the gods, Hermes broadly represented communication and was invoked as the patron and protector of heralds and diplomats. Hermes' association with boundaries was also very broad. He was the god not only of travelers, but also of merchants, thieves, and even the passage from life to death. It was Hermes who led the souls of those who died to the underworld. Hermes was a pastoral god, seen as the protector of shepherds and livestock. Indeed, in his iconography, Hermes was sometimes portrayed as a ram slung over his shoulder to represent his role as god of shepherds. Finally, Hermes was associated with the enigmatic mystery cults of the ancient world, which tended to promise a privileged afterlife attainable through initiation and ritual. Hermes was often regarded as the god who presided over these mysteries. And these mysteries rites then included psychoactive substances, sexual rites, all this type of stuff. Again, the sort of things that pushed against boundaries. Again, we don't need to go through all of these. Let's see here. I thought this was really interesting. Let's look at his family. So, family. Hermes is the son of Zeus and Maia, and the grandson of Atlas, the Titan, who held the heavens on his shoulders. He had countless half-siblings, the products of Zeus's marriages and affairs with various mortals and immortals. These included the gods Apollo, Athena, Ares, Artemis, and Dionysius, as well as the mortal heroes Hercules, Minos, and Perseus. And so, I like, again, when we get into the children of Hermes, you're going to see something very interesting, because you'll see he gives birth to Hermaphroditis, a hermaphrodite. Again, the idea of both male and female parts. He also gave birth to Pan. So Pan is the basis for the word panic. Again, he was the goat-headed, incredibly sexual god, often depicted with an erect penis, with goat legs and a goat head with human torso. And Pan, one of the myths about Pan is that when people walk around a forest or nature, they may hear somebody play a beautiful, soothing melody with their flute. And then as they approach it, they will then encounter a sort of chaotic figure or have an emotional experience of pure panic and terror. And that is part of the myth of Pan. Pan would play his flute, and then he would cause people to have panic. And so, again, perfect for 2020 for sure. As was the norm of the Greek gods, Hermes had a plethora of lovers and children. In line with his commitment to fleeting pleasures, he rarely prolonged his affairs and seldom had more than one child with any of his partners. Oh, okay, so he had a lot of baby mamas, Hermes, which again, quite consistent with the contemporary era. Hermes had a number of important children, including Pan, a symbol of both the wild and the mountains. Pan was known for his raw and voracious sexuality, unstructured musical improvisation on the shepherd's pipes, and having the horns, legs, and rump of a goat. His peculiar anatomy aside, Pan was much like his father. In other stories, Hermes successfully courted Aphrodite and sired Hermaphroditis by her. This Hermaphroditis, who took after both his parents in his shocking physical beauty, would later in life merge his body and that of his female lover, thus becoming a single person with both male and female genitalia. Just like Baphomet, really. Again, and we see another goat-headed figure, so I think some of the semiotics between Baphomet, Pan, or even some of this Hermetic stuff, quite interesting, I think worth noted there. Hermes was also the father of Autolycus, a cunning and famous thief. Once again, the identity of the mother varies in different stories. Autolycus was the grandfather of Odysseus, whose wanderings were the subject of Homer's epic, the Odyssey. This made Hermes the ancestor of the great Odysseus. Family tree. Parents, Zeus. Siblings, okay. Consorts. Children, Hermaphroditis, Pan. So here's the children of Hermes, guys. Again, we can take this metaphorically or archetypal as the sort of fruits of Hermes. We have Hermaphroditus, a hermaphroditic boy who's beautiful and he has both male and female parts. Pan, a voraciously sexual goat-headed deity who's often depicted with an erect penis, plays a flute to lure people into nature, and then he causes pure panic. And then we have Autolycus, which is a thief. So Hermes' children is a hermaphrodite, a sexual deviant, and a thief. Hermes was the origins of Hermes was Hermes was usually said to have been born in secret in a dark cave on the slopes of Mount Cyllene in the Peloponnese, around the region of Arcadia. His mother, Maia, one of the daughters of the Titan Atlas, had retreated there in an attempt to avoid contact with the gods. Zeus found her despite her best efforts and began a sexual relationship that culminated with her conception of Hermes. According to the Homeric hymn to Hermes, Muse seeing... Okay, we don't need to read that. Okay. So here's Hermes' theft of Apollo's cattle. The killing of Argus. Here, we'll read the killing of Argus. This is what I use as the thumbnail. Hermes always accomplished his heroic deeds with wit and guile, never brute strength. And that's where, again, look at the 2020. Look at the Great Reset. Look at the way we're being controlled. We're being controlled by language and words and wit, with, again, what I would say, wit and guile. That's why we're being controlled by. It's not like the soldier is at your front door with the jibby jab, strapping you down and sticking it in your arm. We're not there yet. That would be a different form of sort of imprisonment. Ours is softer. Ours requires our own consent. One famous myth featured Hermes rescuing Zeus's lover Io from the vengeful designs of Hera and the watchful gaze of Argus. Zeus had fallen in love with Io, a young mortal priestess of Hera, and in his lust came down from Olympus to ravish her. When Hera found out about the affair, she set out to find and punish Io. But, to obscure any evidence of his infidelity, Zeus transformed his young lover into a heifer and hid her among a herd of cattle. Hera discovered the ploy and ordered Argus, a giant with many eyes, to watch the herd until Io revealed herself. On the verge of being bested, Zeus appealed to Hermes for assistance. Flying into action, Hermes distracted Argus and most versions by lulling him to sleep. When the all-seeing giant finally closed all his eyes in slumber, Hermes killed him with either a stone or a sword. The adventure resulted in Hermes earning the title Argiophontes, meaning killer of Argus, an epithet which would come to be closely associated with the god. Okay. Hermes and Homer, festivals, temples. We'll look at temples and pop cultures, and then we'll move on here. Guys, smash that like for anybody watching. I hope everybody's enjoying this stream. Again, please support. Throw some love in and send a super chat if you would prefer, and I will get to all those here relatively soon. So, temples to Hermes. Hermes was important centers of worship were on Mount Selene in Arcadia, where he was usually said to have been born, according to myth. The ancient temple of Hermes on Mount Selene was actually built by Lacan, one of the first kings of Arcadia, who was transformed into a wolf for his hubris. Hermes also had temples and sanctuaries in other major cities such as Athens, Sparta, and Thebes. Finally, Hermes' most widespread sanctified spaces were the Herms, semi-anthropomorphic stone pillars adorned with a bust and phallus that were set up along roads, houses, and buildings throughout ancient Greece. A famous historical event illustrates how seriously the Greeks took the Herms. In 1415 BCE, many of the Herms in and around Athens were mysteriously vandalized in the middle of the night. Numerous high-profile suspects were arrested, and one suspect, the general Alcibiades, actually went into exile to avoid a trial and possible execution. Alcibiades ended up defecting to Sparta, with whom the Athenians were fighting at the time. Thus, the religious fears and superstitions of the Greeks ended up influencing interstate politics. Hermes and popular culture. And here's one right here that I really want to nail down. You see how this has the caduceus in it? The caduceus and the rod of Asclepius are not the same thing. And this is another aspect that I think is worth noting in the contemporary period. Next time you go to a hospital, next time you go to a medical facility, look for the caduceus. This is these double serpent entwined staff with wings on top. The rod of Asclepius, so here's the caduceus. You see it right here. Here's the caduceus. This is different from the rod of Asclepius. The rod of Asclepius, let me just pull it in here. Rod of Asclepius. It's a single serpent on a staff. No wings, no two serpents. This was the Hermetic symbol for health. This technically should be the symbol. When any medical hospital or medical provider or anything uses the caduceus, they're using a symbol that actually has nothing to do with medicine. It has everything to do with the god Hermes or Hermes Trismegistus. It has not, or Mercury. It has nothing to do with medicine. Medicine technically should only use the rod of Asclepius. But we see that, like the hospital here in town and the city I live in Franklin, when I look at some of the medical offices, they all have the caduceus, which is not a medical symbol, but it's all over our culture. And so I just want to make that point. Hermes was not the most popular of gods due to his ambiguous reputation. Nevertheless, he and his famous accoutrements often appear in popular culture. Hermes can be found in the most modern depictions of Greek mythology, though these contemporary characters don't always align with his reputation and antiquity. And Disney's Hercules, he is depicted as a geeky, bespectacled messenger who avoids confrontation. And the film version of the Rick Riordan novel Percy Jackson and the Sea of Monsters, Hermes is again presented as a messenger, or more specifically, as an executive of a package delivery company. Quirky and unpredictable, though ultimately well-meaning. Sounds like a tech geek. Hermes, the tech geek is the archetype of Hermes, right? Perfect for the information age. Guys, smash that like. The feathers of Hermes' winged sandals often appear in advertisements and logos as a symbol of swiftness and reliability. Goodyear, for example, has used this symbol to sell its tires. Exactly. Likewise, the logo of FTD Flower Delivery Company features an image of Hermes rushing by with flowers in his hand, shorthand for the swiftness and reliability of its delivery service. Hermes can also be seen in the logos of many national mail services. Absolutely. And again, in Sprint, the Sprint's logo used to be a sandal with a wing on it, which is again indicative of the sandals of Mercury. See, Mercury often, let's see here. If we put it in the god Mercury, and look up images, he is most noted for his winged sandals. See, here's Mercury. He's got wings on his caduceus, wings on his sandals, wings on his back, wings on his head. That dude is winged for sure. And so that's why those wings, like on the Goodyear tires or on Sprint logos, like that's what they're associated with. Perhaps most famously of all, Hermes' staff, the caduceus, winged rod with a pair of snacks around, has been used as a general symbol for medicine and the chief symbol of the American Medical Association. Chief symbol of the American Medical Association, but it doesn't have anything to do with medicine. It has everything to do with magic, language, communication. It's the rod of Asclepius that has anything to do with medicine. I don't understand this. Primary sources. Okay, so that's the sources then. Okay, so now there's a few things that I want to read to you guys again from this book here. Now I have a few more things that we could read, but this book right here, Technosis. Oh my gosh, I'm sweating like a pig. Has some stuff that I want to read to you again in relation to this idea of Hermes as the sort of God of the information age. So here's again, I'm going to bounce around here, so we're just going to jump to the first paragraph here. And so this is not the first paragraph, but this is me just choosing a handful of paragraphs from chapter 1. And so the Greeks make no bones about it. Hermes is a thief. During one of the festivals on the island of Samos, people honored the god by gleefully committing highway robbery. But Hermes' banditry should not be confused with appropriation based on raw power. The information trickster works through cleverness and stealth. He is not the mugger or the thug, but the hacker, the spy, the mastermind. So Hermes is somebody who's participating maybe in what you could call conspiracies, conspiracy theories, conspiracies to work over the entire world, 2020 Kufid conspiracies, yeah. And so when Hermes makes off with Apollo's cattle, he sports a specially designed footwear that leaves no tracks. So he uses technology to commit his crimes, techne. And he forces the animals to walk backwards in order to trick his pursuers. When Apollo finally catches up with the kid, Hermes fools him by proclaiming oaths that, like the slickest legal contracts, do not mean what they seem to say. So the manipulation of language, almost what he's insinuating, legalese. For those of you who don't know, legalese is a sort of language, the English language used in like courts. Those words do not mean the same thing as they mean when they're not inside a courtroom. The words actually have different meanings, different definitions. And so you're using common words with different definitions. This is a sort of legalese, and that's what he's saying that Hermes participated in. He tells the God of truth that, quote, I don't have any information to give, and the reward for information wouldn't go to me if I did, unquote. Finally, the duo journey to Olympus to resolve the conflict. Hermes gives Apollo the lyre, which so pleases the archer that he lets Hermes keep the cattle and grants the young demigod a measure of divine power and prestige. Okay. We're skipping a couple pages here. Again, for those of you who just joined, we're reading out of the book Technosis. Certainly Hermes would approve of the internet, a mercurial network of far-flung messages that function as a marketplace of ideas and commodities. Accessed through the domestic threshold of home computers, the net opens up a technological liminal zone that swamps the self with new paths of possibility. Indeed, the mythic attraction of the net turns on some of the very same qualities associated with the youthful trickster: profit, innovative interconnection, the overturning of established orders and tradition. Of course, the information superhighway is also mythic. In the more modern and critical sense of the term, a strategic distortion, a mirage, a social lie. The utopian rhetoric of the internet paves over a host of troubling issues: the hidden machinations of the new corporate media powers, the potentially atomizing effects of the terminal screen on social and psychological life, and the bedeviling issue of access as communication technologies hardwire the widening global gap between rich and the poor. But Hermes prepares us for such dangers because the merchant of messages traffics with deception. He lies and he steals, and his magic wand closes human eyes forever, drawing us into the deep sleep of forgetting. That's exactly what we're doing right now during the Information Age. Next one that I wanted to read to you guys, here we go, is a clip from, for some of you guys that are into magic are going to be familiar with the book called The Picatrix. The Picatrix is a famous magical text, roughly, it's in the medieval period. It's not, it's hard to establish the specific date, but it's an Arabic magical text, the Picatrix, which tells you what, how to do certain rituals, what substances, plants to use. I have a full version of the Picatrix because it mentions opium and potentially cannabis and stuff like that for some of the rituals for my own personal research. But here, the Picatrix also has a section on Hermes, and we're going to read that and see how the Picatrix, a medieval Arabic text, describes Hermes and how that then relates to the technocratic world that we live in now. So, in the Picatrix, a medieval Arabic tome that contains a welter of occult materials, we find a powerful image of Hermes Trismegistus that strikes, again, Hermes Trismegistus is the amalgamation, it's the anthropomorphic amalgamation of Thoth, Egyptian god, Hermes, Greek god, and Mercury, Roman god, but they're all the same deity. They're all the same type of god within the pagan pantheon. The messenger god, communication god, god of science, technology, god of magic and language. And so it says, Hermes was the first who constructed images by means of which he knew how to regulate the Nile against the motion of the moon. Oh, so Hermes is the first to control nature through symbols. Which, again, I would argue that's what technology, the pushing of a button, these are symbols. So this is technology, but I'm using semiotic processes to then make the technology do things. So same thing is true with a technology like a dam or something, again, that is controlling nature itself. We see that sort of technocratic, right there from the first sentence, a sort of technocratic manipulation of nature and weather, right? He can regulate the Nile against the motions of the moon, meaning the tides themselves, the nature itself. So Hermes' technology can go against the force of nature itself. This man also built a temple to the sun, and he knew how to hide himself from all so that no one could see him, although he was within it, meaning he was within the sun, which then makes you think, it's almost like the false light, like a Luciferian archetype, right? Like a Promethean archetype. That he also built a temple to the sun, and he hid himself inside of it. It was he, too, who in the east of Egypt constructed a city. This is Hermopolis. Hermopolis was the famous city of Hermes. So let me explain how this all happened. Hermes Trismegistus, Thoth, the Greek Hermes, amalgamated, and then Egyptian lore built Hermopolis, which is a city who claimed that Hermes Trismegistus ordered it to be built. So according to Egyptian myth, they believed in the historical Hermes Trismegistus, again, the anthropomorphic amalgamation, and he then decided that they needed to build Hermopolis. It was he, too, who in the east of Egypt constructed a city 12 miles long, within which he constructed a castle which had 4 gates in each of its 4 parts. On the eastern gate he placed the form of an eagle. On the western gate the form of a bull. On the southern gate the form of a lion. And on the northern gate he constructed the form of a dog. And to these images he introduced spirits which spoke with voices, nor could anyone enter the gates of the city except by their permission. So he animated animalistic statues with spirits. Daemons, again, consistent with the Hermetic corpus, which is telling Asclepius exactly how to do this. Around the circumference of the city he placed engraved images and ordered them in such a manner that by their virtue the inhabitants were made virtuous and withdrawn from all wickedness and harm. Oh, wow. So Hermes was able to just perform a semiotic magical ritual which made people virtuous. Wow. So I want to read this next paragraph following that excerpt from the Picatrix. So much of the 20th century is anticipated in this description. The modern technocratic state, there's no symbol more empowering than the regulation and the exploitation of rivers. Here, Trismegistus achieves this goal, but not with brute machines, but with a symbolic technology, magical images that tap the hidden currents of the cosmos. And that's exactly what, again, our digital technologies are doing with electricity. Don't you see? The computer we're using right now, me streaming to you right now, is a magical process that is tapping into the natural currents of electricity in the world. Right, the electrical currents on Earth are being tapped into through these technologies. And so in a way, it's like we build these technologies. This iMac computer I'm using was built by people. Yet in the same way, magically, it's tapping into the sort of natural elements of the world. And it's then it's affecting the world. So through the natural electrical currents of the world, these digital technologies then can make changes. They can do things. They can lift your garage door. They can move your electric car, right? And yet we're tapping into a natural current. This is the sort of a concept, it's like an amalgamation, a transmutation of the sort of natural electrical energy. The currents of the cosmos. But Trismegistus technologies aren't just magical, they're also utopian. So the very intelligence of their design and placement instills goodness within its city's inhabitants while also protecting them from the dark side of human passions. So it's tied with the utopianism. The information age, the age we're in right now, is totally full of utopian thought, right? This is the difference between a true Orthodox Christian phronema and understanding of the world, is that utopia doesn't come until God comes. So there is no ending homelessness. There is no ending poverty and hunger. No, these things are always going to be here. The poor are always going to be here. That's why as Christians, then we're called to help them, because there is no utopia that's just going to get all this stuff out of the way. That's not how it's going to work at all. At all. So we have to become conscientious of that. But it's totally, again, consistent of the 21st century, of these utopian promises, these utopian expectations, just like Hermes and his technologies. Now, another paragraph I want to state here is again, the role of language and how Socrates was a little worried about this. So, though Hermes Trismegistus was renowned for his engineering prowess and the sage's techno-wizardry, also extended into the more incorporeal realms of the human mind. In Plato's Phaedrus, for instance, Socrates tells a fascinating little tale about Thoth, the Egyptian god of magic and invention who would mutate into the Alexandrine mind into Trismegistus. According to Socrates, one day Thoth approached King Thaumas with an offer of a brand new techne, right? That's the Greek word techne, means to an end, writing. This was the new technology, writing. By giving the gift of writing to the king, Thoth hoped to pass on its wonders to all of the Egyptian people, and he promised Thaumas that the new invention would not only augment memory, but amplify wisdom as well. Thaumas carefully considered the matter, weighing the pros and cons of this major communications upgrade. Finally, the king rejected the gift of writing, saying that his people would be better off without it and the new device, the new technology. And reading between the lines of the story, it's clear that Socrates and Plato agreed. However, Plato, as we said, is the first one of these sort of these Greek philosophers to be immersed into the alphabet, right? So I talked about how the alphabet begins with the Phoenicians. The Hebrews take on the alphabet. They have their own Semitic form, the Hebrew alphabet. However, they don't have vowels. Consonant is contained within, meaning's contained in consonant. I've told you about this when I've talked about sigil magic and how you make sigils. But then vowels were introduced in the Greek alphabet, and this was then essentially completed the technology of the alphabet. And I think that's why the Bible, the first half's in Hebrew, Semitic adoption of the alphabet, right? Written, literate, learning people through the prophetic tradition. And then the Bible completes, again, it's completed. The New Testament completes the Old Testament, the Messiah, the Christ, the Logos, using the Greek language, which now has vowels, which is the completion of this technology, right? And then we're called to speak truth. We're called to use the language to venerate and glorify God. But the magic, the Hermetic approach, is you can use these languages to conjure deities, perform rituals, but ultimately attain your own will, fulfill your own will. And I think that is a very big difference. Here is the last paragraph I want to read to you guys. It's for the mystics of alchemy. The psyche is not fixed in stone. So it's talking about, again, Hermeticism, alchemy, technology, and all this different stuff. So, the mystics of alchemy, the psyche is not fixed in stone. Instead, its coarse or base qualities could be refined through psychological and perhaps physiological techniques that draw their inspiration from metallurgic lore. In China, where metal was considered a fifth element alongside earth, water, fire, and wood, this tradition of internal alchemy focused rather obsessively on creating the elixir of immortality. In the Islamic world in Europe, alchemists sought the famous philosopher's stone, an ambiguous and mercurial icon that simultaneously signified a real rock and an extraordinary tincture, and the ultimate goal of transmuting stuff, including the body, into immortal spirit. Among Christian alchemists, the lapis philosophorum became associated not only with Christ the Redeemer, but with the salvation of the world itself, a cornerstone, as it were, for the future New Jerusalem. Now, why did I choose that paragraph? Because you can see how subtle the difference is. The Philosopher's Stone, the elixir of immortality, the transhumanist project was deemed by the magician as the fulfillment of Christ. Right? What's this last sentence say? Among Christian alchemists, so again, not full Christians, but this is due to Protestant Reformation, all this different stuff. Paracelsus would be an example of this, a Christian alchemist. The lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, which again can do all things. It's like the genie's lamp, but you get infinite number of wishes and there's no genie, became associated not only with Christ the Redeemer. So now this stone, you see, they depersonalize it. So Christ is God incarnate as man. And now we're in the 16th century, 1500s, and Christ is associated with a black stone that does all this magic? Huh? But with the salvation of the world itself, a cornerstone. So now we see the magical philosopher's stone being an ambiguous, abstract concept of Christ, right? Non-personified. So it's taking God, which begins with personhood theology and orthodoxy, and as a person who incarnates as a historical person, and then it redefines him as a magical stone? What? Huh? But isn't that exactly what the transhumanists are doing now? And isn't that exactly where the Antichrist is going to lead people? To worshiping a false version of God incarnated as the Antichrist, which is going to be fused with the sort of transmutation of the transhumanist project. He's no longer going to be fully human. And that's going to be considered a new cornerstone of what? The inversion. It's the inversion. And that's why I think this paradigm, the sort of the transhumanism and the sort of Hermetic paradigm is so subtle to the Christian paradigm and borrows and sort of conflates in different ways with a lot of it. Like we talked about with the social justice, the sort of ambiguous sentiment, right? The purification of repentance is like getting the jibby jab, right? We see all these sort of, it's like the Eucharist. It's like that which enters your body to purify you. When I read that, I couldn't help but make that association that the Christian alchemists believed that the philosopher's stone was going to be Christ, or was reminiscent of Christ, and then we look at the technologies and the sort of them being false cornerstones, if you will, right? The new Philosopher's Stone is going to be the sort of digital technologies. It's the black screen. That's what it is. It's the black mirror, which is the black Philosopher's Stone. It is the Philosopher's Stone, right? It could be anything. That's it, right? It's this black screen. It can be anything I want, anything I choose, anything I wish, right? That's interesting stuff. I didn't think about that, but it just popped in my head there. It's the black screen is the black obsidian Philosopher's Stone. Anyways, guys, that's going to conclude some of the excerpts I wanted to read to you from Eric Davis. I want to dive into some of these super chats now. I had another article